Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is Deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On this show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, franchising, and more. My name is Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the DealQuest Podcast. Let's get started. DealQuest community, this is a solocast this week, and I want to talk about a topic that comes up somewhat frequently in deals, certainly in M&A in various industries, and that is this conversation of successors and really what's often called the G2, Generation 2 or Generation 3, and how it impacts M&A deals. And one of the things obviously that people talk about in that is it gives you the possibility of doing an internal succession deal. Right? If you don't have anybody who could take over, right, a next generation, so to speak. And when I say generation, obviously it doesn't have to be an age difference. It could be a stage of career difference. But the point is somebody who's willing to stay around if you, as the owner or ownership team or whatever is gone, if you have that next generation, that G2 or that G3, even meaning you have a multiple succession plan, it gives you the possibility to do an internal succession deal, which is not on the table if you have nobody internally that can take it over. So in those cases where you don't have somebody, you'll have to do it as as an outside deal if you can. I mean, not every business is saleable. We've talked about that in the past, right? There are a lot of businesses that just never monetize. But if you're in a position where you can monetize, then it does give you this internal succession option. However, this is not actually what I want to focus on, because I want to focus on how having a G2, a second generation, next generation, or beyond can actually help and hinder sometimes or cause problems with or things you have to think about and what those are in terms of a potential external sale. Because just because you have a next generation of executives or like in the financial advisor space, in the wealth management space, the second generation of advisors who may have their own books of business. In other industries, it could be any other kind of service business where people do have direct client relationships, or maybe, even if it's in some other kind of business, whether it's tech or manufacturing or whatever, they play key roles where they're essential to the ongoing operations of the business or to business development or whatever key factor they play. But they're not the kind of people either in the position, whether it's financially or they want to become entrepreneurs or they, or whatever it is that cause you not to do an internal succession. So now you are looking at externally. And so what comes up for this conversation of companies with or without a next generation on external M&A deals? So there's a few factors. Number one, it is a positive factor in terms of getting value and being saleable if you do have that next generation, right? That executive team, those key players that are not you as the founder or founders of founding group who can run the company. Maybe they're already running the company ideally. If you're, as of today, not crucial to the running of the company, that's ideal. But certainly, even if you are, if there is that next generation of key executives, of key players, of future leaders, current leaders, even becoming bigger leaders, however you want to look at it, it certainly can help even in an external M&A deal. Now, let me sort of break this down, right? There are certainly some deals in some industries, especially in those where people is less, are less crucial, right? Could be, and I'm not saying people aren't crucial in every business, but obviously a company, if you have a tech product that, a SaaS product, right? That is not where people aren't front facing, then there still may be crucial people behind, but it's still a little different than, let's say, in financial services or legal or accounting or whatever, where a lot of the client relationships are directly related to people, and losing those people may have you directly lose customers or clients, whereas somebody who's on a behind the scenes, even crucial functionality might not have that exact direct correlation, right? But in all these cases, depending upon who the buyer is, what that business is, the G2 could be a big benefit or maybe less so. So, for example, if you are selling to a company that's well-staffed, they don't really need extra talent. They may want people to stay around for transition. It might be some additional bonus benefit for them to get some good talent, but their main reason is your client list or your particular product that they can integrate with theirs. Maybe they're in the same exact business and they're just acquiring for scale and to eliminate a competitor. Maybe they have an adjacent product where your product is complementary to theirs, where they can roll it in which case they probably have some specific product and market expertise at the selling company in G2 that might be crucial. But for the most part, they have infrastructure, they have tech, they have a team that they can roll things into. Some of the people, and some of that next generation, maybe if it's like, let's say the CFO or people like that, maybe less necessary. But in businesses where there are direct client relationships, where that next level, generation two, often talked about in the wealth management field where we do a lot, has actual client relationships and controls either their own book of business and or some combination of servicing and having direct relationships with business that might have been developed by the founders originally, then it's a different ballgame, right? And what happens is, especially in those cases on the buy side, it's going to be a much more of a condition of the deal that the buyers get some assurances that the G2 is on board and wants to stay around and is incentivized enough from the deal to be, willing and excited about doing so. And in such cases, that can actually increase valuations, right? Because there's less risk of losing clients when there's a transition. So let's say the founders sell to a bigger company and they're going to transition out over a period of time, right? A year, 6 months consulting agreement, maybe it's a few years. But the point is that there's continuity in people that have direct client relationships. That's going to bring value. And certainly, even if, it may bring additional values, period, just on the purchase price. But also it helps assure, to the extent that many deals have earnout pieces or contingent retention required pieces for clients, having that G2 helps increase the chances that contingent money or that growth earnout, the CAGRs, are going to be hit because you have that continuity of people who have a relationship with the clients, right? So that brings in more opportunity. So while having a G2 gives you an internal succession option as well, which is great, right? Because you can consider that it's one more thing to do. It also can make you more attractive and more valuable. So not only increasing the value, but also increasing the number and types of buyers that would be interested in you, right? Because if you have buyers that don't have that next generation or capacity for their existing team to take business over, they may not be interested in you if you're going to leave and there's nobody to take over that business, right? Whereas you bring to the table, if you have that generation two, more varieties of buyers who might be able to be interested because they don't have to have internally that capacity that can take over what you do and your client relationships. Now, where do the challenges come up? Well, one of the biggest challenges that comes up is in a situation where that generation two, those key, next generation or executives or players or business developers or however you want to look at them and whoever they are in the given situation, control practically more of the business relationships and success of the business than they are getting rewarded for. And certainly if they're not, let's say, equitized. So let me talk about a common scenario that comes up, which sometimes derails deals or at least creates some work for people like me to help clients figure out how we make this work for everybody when the time comes. So the situation is this. You have a founder or founders own 100% of the equity, right? These are the personal people who founded the company. They own it. They have key generation two employees that have not equitized them, right? Maybe they're making very, very great compensation, high levels. I'm not even talking about a situation where people aren't well taken care of or respected or valued, but they're valued on a comp level, let's say, or a bonus level. Maybe there's a profit sharing plan or some sort of synthetic or phantom or virtual equity, right? But they don't have true ownership. Now what happens, right? Me and my founders, to use an example, are selling the company. We want to get capital gains treatment. We want as much of the value of that deal to come in as purchase price for the deal as opposed to future compensation, because that purchase price is at capital gains rates for us as sellers, whereas any comp is at ordinary income rates. Plus, comp can be contingent upon clauses in an employment agreement, even if you get one that guarantees any kind of term, if you're not an at-will employee in the deal, that, have cause, or various ways to terminate the employment agreement, which would cut off the comp. Whereas if it's purchase price, now it might be contingent upon certain retention of business or growth of business or whatever, but at least if you hit that, you're going to get that money. Plus, obviously, the tax benefit of the capital gains. So the issue is that let's say most deals are done as an asset sale, but even if the deal is done as an equity sale, you're selling your stock in the company or your membership interest in LLC, only the owners can sell that, right? The ownership, and only the owners, even if it's an asset sale, which is 90+% of the deals, only the owners, the true equity owners, not the virtual, not the profit sharing people, only the true people who own real equity get to be entitled to get the value of that purchase price at capital gains rates, right? So now let's take a scenario where you've got generation two that, let's make it easy. Let's say they're in one of these services businesses where they control client relationships, right? Maybe even they've originated them on their own, or they've been handed off to them, or they jointly work with the founders, but maybe they're the people day to day, and there's risk that if that the client would be more loyal to the G2 person than to the founder, just because that's who they've been dealing with, maybe exclusively or mostly over the last year or two or 5 or 10, maybe even. What happens in that kind of deal? Well, here's the concerns that happen. One is that, what if the G2 doesn't want to go along with the deal? They're looking at it. They're going to get rolled into a bigger company. Maybe that's less interesting to them or comfortable with them than being in a more entrepreneurial environment. Maybe even they thought that they were going to be able to take over the company from the founders, either because it was promised originally or discussed at least, or maybe it's just because it was an assumption. Now suddenly they're not going to get that. They're not getting any of the purchase price directly. Maybe you can agree to, jumping to a potential, you can agree to bonus them some extra money, do a retention bonus, something like that. But that's an ordinary income rates, not capital gain rates. And, is the comp structure going forward going to be satisfactory to that G2 in the new company when they're looking at alternatives? Now, part of their alternatives may depend upon whether they have enforceable or lack thereof, a lack of enforceable, non-competes, non-solicits, non-accepts, non-services agreements. And that's really dependent upon what the agreements say, state by state, what their role is. If they're purely in an employment role, I don't even want to make generalizations because it's different in California, for example, than other places. But in some states, the non-solicitation portion might be more likely to be valid, and non-compete much less likely. A non-service, non-accept depends upon the state, really varies. But, they may have an option to go out and potentially take clients, whether that's with or without solicitation. Or, even if they weren't going to take clients, if they leave and clients are going to leave the firm, even if they're not going to go with the employee who's left, that's going to reduce the value of the company. If you're going to lose 30% of your business, somebody left, even if they're not going to take it with them, that's a problem. So that employee, that's G2, has leverage practically when you tell them that you're doing a deal. If they practically control business relationships and they don't feel like they're adequately compensated in the new deal going forward, and or because they have not been equitized or adequately equitized. Sometimes we see situations where somebody has 5% or 10% of the company, but they control 30 or 40% of the business, right? So, there's a disconnect there. Now, going to what are some solutions? One is the way I alluded to, which is the way a lot of clients think of. First, well, listen, I can just bonus somebody, right? I'll take care of them. I'll give them a portion of the purchase price. And technically, that's not what's happening with an employee. You're getting the full purchase price into the company. Let's say it's an asset deal, and then you're giving them additional comp or bonus. But the way the founders will look at it is a quote unquote portion of the purchase price. And listen, that's real money. That may be enough of an incentive, even though it's taxed at ordinary income rates. You could always gross it up, right? You do get a deduction for that as in the company. So maybe you gross it up to take into account the fact that it's going to be taxed at higher rates. So that, that's one possibility. Another possibility is that if you have some time, especially if you got, let's say, a year, so that you can get to the long-term capital gains, you can try to equitize the G2 a year in advance of doing a deal, and then have them own that equity for a year, and then be able to transition that at long-term capital gains rates a year and a day later. There are issues with that, however, because the company has value. I'm assuming if you're thinking you're going to be able to sell it a year later, the company has value, right? So that transfer of value, if the advisor or the employee or the generation two, and whatever business it is not buying in and paying their portion for that, the fair market value for that, then there are tax implications of just granting true equity to them. So, there's transfer value issues. So it's hard to do that later in the game. Now, I've talked about this a little bit in some of the episodes of the podcast, and I won't go down the detail in the rabbit hole, but another potential solution is if they truly control client relationships on their own, it is possible. And a million caveats. And again, we're not going to, take this with a grain of salt because you have to do it right. It's got to meet the right requirements. You're usually going to get a valuation, all this stuff. But if you can show that the G2 has what we call personal goodwill, meaning that clients are with them because of their personal reputation, standing, and whatever, not because of the company, and there are going to be certain restrictions on them going forward. Again, there's a lot of moving pieces to this. It may be possible to, even though they don't own any of the company, to do a portion of what would have been the purchase price to go to them directly as a purchase of their personal goodwill. Not every buyer is willing to do that, however. And again, not every seller or deal qualifies for it. You have to meet certain criteria. But you want to think these things through. I've seen too many founders and business owners make assumptions that, the G2 is going to be fine, or they can throw a few bucks at them and they're going to come along. And then it screws up a deal as they get closer to closing, because I've had situations, over the last couple of years, we've had two situations that I can think of, and maybe more. We've done, out of 30, 40, 50 deals over the last couple of years, there are probably two or three situations that I remember where, some people left during the sale process because they weren't happy with the incoming deal. And listen, there's only so much you can do as a seller. You can bonus people money, you can give all this stuff, but if the ongoing, especially if you have somebody who's a lot younger, has a long leeway. Let's say, classic, let's say you're in your 60s, you're fine doing a year or two, and then, you want to be done, but you have someone else who are in their 30s and 40s, and they got a 20, 30-year career. Even if you throw in some extra money now, if they're forced into a comp program at the buyer that doesn't have as much upside as they thought they had, in a more smaller independent place, then even if you give them some incentive money up front, all right, or share, quote unquote, a portion of the purchase price with them, or give them a retention bonus, that may not work because they're looking in the long term and they're saying, wait a second, okay, I'm going to make some extra money now, but is that going to be enough for me in this comp plan going forward? Or should I jump to somewhere else and maybe start my own firm? And wouldn't that be better for me? So, one of the things that we talk about in exit, in succession, in M&A, is that you want to try to plan much further in advance than people do. And if you're looking at this 5 years in advance, there are a lot more options than if you're looking at this at the time of sale, or even, within a year of sale. Because if you have key players and you're 5 years out, there are many more options in how you can bring people into the equity stack in a way that doesn't become impossible financially or cause major tax issues over time, to be able to get them in a position to have an equity class. Maybe it's what we call a profits interest, meaning they don't pay for it up front because they're not getting the value of the company to the point they're issuing it. Like, let's say the company's been around for 5 years. They don't get the value of the company at that date, but we have 5 more years before we're going to sell. And if that's the case, then they can get the increased value. They're not taxed in the beginning because it's a profits interest or an option out of the money or whatever it is that is not taxable now. And again, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of what you got to require for it to be non-taxable. But effectively, if you have something where somebody is not participating in the existing value of the company, only the growth, there are ways to have it be non-taxable upon issuance. If you have 5 years, you can do that. Now they get to participate in the increased growth of the company over these 5 years, even if they don't participate in the back end. They can even have a catch-up piece where they do participate in the back end in a way that's not taxable as well. So my point, more so than going down that rabbit hole, because I could spend an hour just on any aspect of those structures, is that the more time you have, the more options you have to reduce the chances to, first of all, lock in that generation 2, which again, you become more attractive to buyers and at higher values. Number 2, have a higher chance they stay around, and because they're going to benefit from the deal going forward, and that they'll be enthusiastic, to stay on for the deal, and that they won't potentially totally screw up your deal, or at least create a decrease in purchase price because they've left and taken clients, or or key personnel have been gone. So you want to start thinking about how you incentivize. We do a lot of stuff around attraction, retention, and incentive vehicles for employees. And by the way, this is not just to keep them around for an exit. I mean, there are other reasons, right, why you just want to retain great talent and incentivize them or attract key people to your company. And there's a number of ways to do that through profit sharing or for phantom equity or equity appreciation rights or profits as you sold, all this stuff. So we do that even for companies that are not anticipating an exit in any time soon. But it does provide a potential advantage going forward. And certainly if you are on the horizon, in the next 5 years or so, or even longer, to be able to create this path that has people stay and be excited and whatever, can really make a difference in external M&A. Now, listen, this all assumes a very first thing, which is a problem in some industries, and certainly in the investment advisor space, in the wealth management space, has been a huge issue, which is actually the fact that there is a G2 or G3, that there is a development of young talent coming into the industry, being trained up, staying in the industry, wanting to stay with your company in the first place, because you can't incentivize, train, retain, et cetera, help monetize or equitize a G2 if there isn't a G2, right? So some industries do that a lot better than others. And as a company, if you can do that, if you can find and train up and qualify and retain folks, your odds of having optionality and increased value and better terms, right? It's not just the total value, but it's also, how much is contingent and all this kind of stuff, better deal structures, is all way, 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 way better if you have a solid G2 that you've thought about how you're going to retain, potentially equitize, or at least find other ways to keep them on board and excited and give you that optionality of having that. But by the way, I mean, it's like most things that are great practices in business. Even if you never sell, having a great team that's invested, staying on, whatever, and can run the company, ideally without you, is a phenomenal thing. Gives you the internal succession option and makes you more valuable and brings more bias to the table and better structures, assuming that you do well with the G2, even for outside buyers. So think about that generation 2, think about that ideally G3, who's that executive team, who are those key, younger in their career players who can create all these options for you. And really look out for the pitfalls and talk to, key advisors to help you plan for and reduce those potential pitfalls well in advance, and you'll be in much better shape. So that's it for this solocast. Look out next week for a great episode with a phenomenal guest, and I'll be back in 4 weeks with another solocast. Take care, folks. Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. If you are interested in finding out more about my law firm, the services we provide to entrepreneurial and growing companies across industries all over the country, and my partner Brian Megan and I, and my amazing team, just head over to kupferlaw.com. That's kupferlaw.com. And if you want to follow more of my content, head over to my LinkedIn page where I post regularly. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.